Hello, and welcome to October Speaker Series. It's October. My name is Melissa Romaine, and I'm a Senior Program Officer on the Leadership Programs team at the Mozilla Foundation. It is my privilege to introduce our facilitator for today's panel, titled Free Speech, What is it and Who's Responsible? Renée DiResta is a Mozilla Fellow and the Head of Policy at Data for Democracy. As a fellow, she shares her expertise and works with our executive teams to explore how Mozilla can contribute to today's conversations about disinformation and media manipulation. Renée investigates the spread of malign narratives across social networks and assists policymakers in understanding and responding to the problem. She has advised Congress, the State Department, as well as other academic, civic, and business organizations. She has studied disinformation and computational propaganda in the context of pseudoscience conspiracies, terrorism, and state-sponsored information warfare. And as she's doing today, Renée regularly writes and speaks about the role that tech platforms and curatorial algorithms play in the proliferation of disinformation and conspiracy theories. So thank you all for being here. Please ask any questions you might have through the Speaker Series Slack channel, or enjoy if you're listening from elsewhere. Renée. The light came on though. Is it on? It's really right up here. There we go.
Hello. Hello.
We're going to do a momentary swap here. There we go. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited to have this conversation. When we discussed this topic, I thought, I know two people who would be really great for this. Guillaume, who I know in the context of Center for Humane Technology, and had actually met him when I read his work on YouTube's recommendation engine algorithm, some work that he did for The Guardian about recommendation engines pushing people towards particular types of content, and how engaging with certain types of content actually kind of privileges more sensational content over things that we might consider better information as opposed to just content. And then Mike and I met years ago, I think in the context of a DMCA takedown gone wrong. Yeah. And so we have disagreed on many things over the years, but always very civilly. And so I really like the idea of bringing him in and having a little bit of a debate, a little bit more of people who really disagree, but have strongly rooted philosophical underpinnings to thinking about the speech infrastructure that we have, the relationships between speech and harassment, the relationships between speech and amplification and algorithms. And so I'm very excited to introduce the two of them. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by letting them actually introduce themselves and their work. So each is going to speak for a few moments about what they focus on. So, Guillaume?
So yeah, I was an engineer at YouTube working on the recommendation AI, and now I built a website called algotransparency.org that helps people understand what AI is actually recommending in terms of conspiracies. We often notice that fiction outperforms reality from the AI point of view.
Okay, Mike Masnick. So I run a blog called TechDirt where I write about a lot of this stuff. I also run a related think tank called the Copi Institute, where we do a bunch of research and hold events related to this. On this issue, I have a lot of very strong opinions concerning free speech and technology and how innovation plays into both enabling greater speech, but then also understanding the consequences of that.
Can we swap this mic out? One of the things I wanted to, I'd love to have you start with, Mike, is you recently wrote a post about ways not to be a free speech jerk, I think you called it, or something along those lines. I thought.
I think it was hypocrite.
Okay. And I thought this is an interesting framing, kind of in the modern era, by someone who understands algorithms, understands technology, and has very strong thoughts about how not to be a free speech hypocrite. I'd love you to just kind of tell the audience a little bit about how you see the sort of very basic, at a very basic level, what free speech is today and how that might have changed.
That's a very broad question. I mean, free speech as a concept, I think, is pretty straightforward. Generally speaking, when you're talking about free speech in the American context, certainly you're talking about the First Amendment and whether or not the government can, have any regulations against that get in the way of your speech or expression. And what is interesting nowadays is that obviously we have the internet, which at a first pass enabled much greater communication and much greater speech, much greater expression globally. As an initial reaction, I think many of us thought that was a really good thing. Many of us still think that was a really good thing as a network to allow for such great, incredible global communication. I think what has happened in the last few years is that there's been growing concern, whether legitimately or illegitimately, that a number of very large companies have created platforms that that have basically taken over the role of being the platform on which that speech occurs. And with that has come a bunch of good things and bad things, I think is the diplomatic way of putting it. When you have obviously Facebook, Twitter, YouTube being sort of the main ones, but there are a few others, those platforms have become the space where much of this speech is happening. And that has opened up both good things and bad things. Again, one is that it has allowed for people to communicate around the world that had never communicated before. And sometimes, that's good, but it also has allowed for harassment, spam, fake news, if you want to use that term, though I hate it, but everyone understands it, so we'll use it for shorthand, and other sorts of scams and whatnot. So the question that has now come out that a lot of people are discussing is, what does this mean when we have so much speech enabled by platforms? What does it mean when there is bad speech on that platform? And bad is a very, very loaded term. Any other term I would use there is equally, if not more loaded. So again, using it for the sake of shorthand, everyone sort of understands what you mean by that. And so there's one element that says there's all this speech on these platforms. These platforms have central control over what appears on those platforms. In the US, certainly, those platforms also have a First Amendment right themselves to determine whether or not they allow any speech on their platform or disallow any speech on their platform. They're allowed to make those moderation choices. And so then there just becomes a question of what should be done about, if anything, about bad speech. And that's where I think the larger debate then comes in. Should those platforms be determining what speech is allowed, what speech should be taken down? Should there be laws involved in, getting in, telling the platforms what should be allowed, what should not be, which runs into some First Amendment questions. There are questions about, are there alternative ways to allow for, increasing the good speech and decreasing the bad speech? What are the unintended or intended consequences of all of those things? And it's something that I think everyone is or should be thinking about and struggling with right now, because I don't think there are necessarily easy answers. I have strong opinions on, why certain things will create all sorts of, potentially bad consequences that we haven't necessarily thought through. But I think what should be clear, and what hopefully most people would agree on, is that there aren't any easy answers to this. Any sort of attempt to, to deal with these challenges introduces a whole bunch of new questions. And so, my general position on this is that we should be very, very careful before, mandating certain results, because it create a whole bunch of other consequences.
Now, Guillaume, I'd love you to walk through, as you do the work that you do at Algo Transparency, attempts to kind of quantify some of those consequences, right? To look at the bad speech that Mike was describing and to look at the downstream effects of algorithmic amplification, of algorithms deciding what is raised or lowered, and then what we see, the kind of downstream impact of that. I'd love to hear you describe a little bit more about the work that you do scoping the problem.
Exactly. So I think it starts from a misconception is that with social media, like some politicians have said that information goes directly to the people. And that's not true. The algorithm filter all the information that comes to you and decide which information you should see and which information you shouldn't see. So it's very important to understand how this filter works because I worked on them. On that they are not neutral, they have some bias depending on how they were implemented, and it's okay that they have bias, but we should see which kind of bias they have.
And how do you, specifically, since most of us here are in tech, I'd love to hear you describe a little bit about how you are working to quantify that, both the bias and then the impact.
So the idea is to reverse engineer the algorithm, like try to understand what gets amplified by the algorithm and what's not amplified. So for instance, on YouTube, you can follow the recommendation and see which videos get recommended to you by the algorithm. And when you compare that to what gets shown in search results, you see the impact of the algorithm. And you see that this algorithm is, of course, not neutral, and it's important to understand in which direction.
Can you talk a little bit about any of the specific factors that are influencing that? I know what I've seen is accounts like, I look at propaganda a lot, and we see RT kind of constantly coming up to the top, largely because they have a very strong base of extremely highly viewed videos from back in 2014, 2015 timeframe. So they have a lot of what we call like disaster porn. Videos of the tsunami that have been viewed 70 million times, or if you go and pull it up, you'll see the last comment was an hour ago, even though the video is from 2013. So things that continue to reinforce the idea that RT is producing compelling content that people watch the whole way through and then engage with. I'm curious what other signals you see.
Yeah, so to understand that, this kind of porn that you said, is you have to understand that the algorithm is developed to maximize watch time. So YouTube talked about that publicly and said, okay, watch time is amazing because if you wouldn't be happy with what you have, you would leave, wouldn't you? And that's debatable, but then it favors all this kind of clickbait, disaster porn, etc., etc. So then in terms, it favors people who really understand the algorithms and know how it works, so they know exactly how much cats you have to put on, how much disaster you have to put on to try to create the perfect clickbait, and then bring your users to your content, and then push propaganda in the amount, in the perfect amount.
So, Mike, when we think about impact and Guillaume's work on 3 Degrees of Alex Jones, or a number of the other kind of things that we see this sort of constantly surfacing, do you have an opinion on the value of the content that the platforms show, or do you think that that's entirely too prescriptive a way to think about this conversation?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. What do you mean? So
I mean, the algorithm privileging the sensational over a more, perhaps if we were searching for a current event, a more newsworthy, and I think that my belief, and I don't know if you agree with this, is that there is such a thing as a higher caliber source. I don't like the relativistic nonsense so that this is my own personal take, that all sources are created equal. That's not true.
Yeah.
And so when we think about the algorithm privileging sources that create sensational content, how do we think about that in the balance of the value?
Yeah, no, I think our views are actually probably a lot more aligned than you may have set up the conversation to suggest. No, I think obviously, you talk about algorithmic bias, right? I mean, an algorithm, has to have bias, right? I mean, it's recommending something, therefore it is biasing some content one way or the other. The question is, what is that bias, which gets to the transparency question, and what kinds of things are you trying to recommend? And a lot of the platforms right now have built algorithms that as far as we can tell, and you may have much more insight into this than I do, are sort of biasing on engagement, loosely defined, and that does not necessarily mean good, right? I mean, so a lot of the stuff that we see and sort of, you know, becomes the stories that we all talk about, where you're seeing, like, you know, Alex Jones constantly recommended, or, you know, so to take a little step outside, and then I'll get back to the specific question. You know, that piece that I wrote about the free speech hypocrite was specifically around this guy, Jordan Peterson, who is a sort of fairly well-known, I'm not going to come up with the right diplomatic word to describe him. Yeah. Right. Well, I called him a free speech hypocrite. So, you know, and you can go and read why I think he's a free speech hypocrite. But, you know, in writing about him, I first wrote about him a few months ago. And in order to do that, because he is sort of ever present on YouTube, I watched a couple of his videos, or more than a couple of his videos, but I was understanding, you know, what he was talking about, and looking for examples to use in the article that I was writing about him. And then ever since then, you know, the recommendations on my YouTube include Jordan Peterson videos, because apparently he has done approximately 3 million videos on YouTube, and you're also, according to his fans, not supposed to comment on anything he says until you've watched all of those 3 million videos, which YouTube now wants to make sure that I do, because it's always recommended. So, but I think that ties back to the question that you asked, which is that there are sort of, you know, better and more relevant sources, and I think right now that these platforms are definitely keyed towards, you know, what is going to get the click, right? And so it's sort of, you know, the next general evolution of what used to be referred to as clickbait. Yeah. Is that you're looking for something that's going to get attention, and obviously these platforms have sort of keyed off of that, and you can understand why. Like, it's a natural progression. It wasn't sort of a negative or evil reason for this. Well, some people may argue otherwise, but I think there's a natural reason for it. Where it then gets tricky is if you aren't going to key off of that for the algorithm, what do you key off of? And so you can say, well, we should sort of pre-designate a whitelist of these are high-quality sources, and you can determine what those might be, New York Times, whoever else, right? You're always going to then lead to a few different potential problems with that. One is that there are going to be a group of people out there who insist that the New York Times is fake news. I don't know who would say that, but they may be the president of the United States. You're going to have some people who also point out that there are other sources. You know, part of the power and wonder of the open internet was the fact that, you know, you didn't have to get published in the New York Times to publish an interesting, thoughtful, important piece of work and get attention for it. And so you worry about, if you are specifically whitelisting out or biasing sort of predetermined credible sources, that you are then downplaying and potentially harming those other voices that many of us think are important. And so it becomes a really difficult situation. Now, you know, I agree, and I can look at something, and I can look at, you know, YouTube recommending Jordan Peterson videos or Alex Jones videos and say, guys, like, I don't want this. And there are some not very well known, not necessarily easy to find tools that allow you to say, like, hey, no, stop. You know, I watched this for one thing, go away. I don't ever want to see it again. It would be nice if we saw more of that. And then the sort of other thing that I've been talking about a lot lately is that I think we should push a lot more power to the end users in terms of tools to make those determinations themselves, for them to say publicly, like, you know, if it's a situation where, like, I had to watch these videos, I don't want any more recommendations of it, let me designate that in a way that can be shared. Or even better, if you can structure it so that, you know, if I trust somebody else, or I trust a group of other people to manage a filter or some sort of view into the content that I want to see, you know, I think we should have more of that. So instead of just relying on the platforms themselves to make those decisions, you know, if I could, you know, have a group of friends or an organization that I trust and say, I want to see the YouTube filter that EFF puts together, or the ACLU, or whoever else, I think that would be a lot more valuable than just relying on YouTube specifically to make all the determinations globally for the filter that everyone has to use in terms of, or the algorithm that everybody has to use in terms of which content is good and which is bad.
This is sort of the where do we put the paternalism? Like, where does the nudge go? How far down in the user value chain? You've written about this as well. I know you have a lot of strong thoughts on giving users more control of their experience. I'd love you to talk about that.
Exactly, that's something we need, but for Google, it's very tricky to do that. So I tried to do that inside Google actually, and I noticed how much it gets tricky when you want to push that kind of tools to production, because there's, of course, managers are scared that it would decrease watch time or that it would just not increase it. So it's not the focus of YouTube. The focus is to increase watch time. So developing this kind of tools that enable people to get outside their filter bubble, to not see the same content over and over again when they don't want to see it. Like, for instance, right now.
I want to actually ask about that really quickly. If we give people control, we effectively give them their filter bubble, right? I think that's pretty well documented in psychological research. So people are going to choose to see the things that make them happy, which is what the platforms are keying off of now automatically. So this is where I'm curious about the idea that putting the paternalism down and removing it entirely, giving it to the user, does just mean that there are going to be people where Alex Jones and Jordan Peterson are all that they see, and maybe that's fine. It's more a matter of, is there we used to have an idea that there was like a shared epistemology or like a core basis in fact, and I do wonder if you give it entirely to the user and empower them, if you are also in some ways disempowering them by virtue of allowing them to live solely in that bubble.
I mean, it's already like that. They're already stuck into filter bubbles of drinking game videos, Jordan Peterson, Alex Jones. It's already like that. If we give them a tool to get out of that, it's difficult to do something worse than what's going on right now.
No, what's your take on that?
Yeah, no, I actually agree. I mean, we are already in that world, and I've heard this argument a lot, and it may be true that pushing the power out to the ends and giving the end users more control maybe creates greater filter bubbles, though it would be difficult. But I think it's worth testing that theory, because I don't think it's necessarily true. It might be, and I'm willing to, we should run an experiment, and we should watch, and we should monitor and see what happens. And if it goes wrong, be ready to deal with it. But I'm not sure that's really what happens in the end. I think that, part of the problem now, and the reason why we end up with these sort of weird bubbles of insanity as we're seeing, is that we're trying to build these algorithms for everyone, right? And we're having one party build these algorithms for everyone. If we are able to push the control out to the end, and again, I want to emphasize, that doesn't just mean the end user themselves making all the decisions themselves, because then the pushback is nobody's going to do that. I mean, a very, very small percentages. But what I'm talking about is if we can push the control out so that not just the end users can make decisions, but also other third parties. What I said before, if somebody could use the EFF's filter or the ACLU's filter or some other third party, some trusted third party, or person, the idea being that you could share these things, that actually allows for competition at the algorithm or filter level. And competition generally tends to build out better results. And I think that if you can do that and allow for this competition to happen for how we filter or recommend certain content, we will get better results than just relying on the single source, which is the platform itself, which has certain things to key off of. And because of that, I think there will always be some people who want to live in the crazy nut job filter bubble, and that may happen. But I actually think we are less likely to get the general population to be sort of forced into those realms as well, because people will naturally sort of gravitate towards, better algorithms, better filtering that is more reasonable and not so crazy. That may be a very naive, optimistic viewpoint on how people will react. but I tend to think that's actually a likely outcome.
Let's talk really briefly then about time horizons. So we have, you are both in agreement that we have problems today. I agree with you both on that. What is the short-term fix while the longer term sounds like you're both advocating for more granular user controls? You maybe have an idea of how long it actually takes to implement that. I do not. But I'm curious, like in the kind of immediate short term, who comes in and steps in, and then looking out at a longer horizon, especially when we talk about the difference between regulation, self-regulation, building tools for users. Like, how do you guys see the different solutions across time horizons?
So I think, yeah, the short term, it's important to monitor what's actually going on, because in the 2016 election, for instance, you had two sex scandals that happened. You had like Hollywood access tape, and you had Pizzagate. And actually, Pizzagate was recommended much more than Hollywood access tape on YouTube. So you had like a complete alternative reality that unfolded, and nobody even knew about it. Like most people didn't even know about that. So what's actually going on right now during the election, we don't know. So the first thing, immediate term, is to look what's going on the platform, what gets pushed by the algorithm. And then on the long term, I totally agree with your vision of trying new systems that gives more control to end users and to third party who are dedicated to protecting the user. So if the people who you trust, who are actually there to protect you, it's going to be much better than if you have a company that wants to maximize profit and metrics on a quarterly basis.
And do you think that this has a positive impact then on the allegations of conservative bias? You think that the transparency is a fix for that?
So it's going to help Google, because what's going on right now is that Google can't even reply like, no, we don't have a conservative bias, because they don't want to say what's recommended. So Jordan Peterson, for instance, who has been like insanely recommended, is been viewed more than 250 million times on his channels, on videos that have his name in the title. He's been recommended more than 1 billion times by the algorithm, and then he can imply that he's being censored by the platform because there is no data about it. So I have a bit of data about it, and I see that he's massively recommended. So.
And then for the longer term, as we think about the fact that there are these tensions with the business model, there are these sort of unwillingness to be transparent, which maybe is shifting. Maybe I think we've seen a little bit more of that, particularly from Facebook, the transparency reports and things that Twitter has put out. How do you see the role of regulators? I know you've both written and talked extensively about CDA Section 230, which for anybody who isn't familiar with it is the kind of carve out that offers the platforms the right to moderate, but also indemnifies them from liability. That is the intermediary liability doctrine that says that they are not responsible for what is on their platform. There have been carve-outs to it recently in the form of SESTA and FOSTA, which you've written quite extensively about as well, as a strongly opposed to it. Sort of unintended consequences that I think did sort of fall out of that particular piece of legislation. But Senator Wyden, who is one of the authors of the original Communications Decency Act back in '98, I believe, has recently come out saying that this was not the intent. The indemnification intent was not to absolve them of their responsibility to moderate. So as we talk about speech, one of the big things that's been alluded to a couple times, harassment, fake news, a number of these things, the platforms have the right to moderate, but have not necessarily been proactive in moderation because there has been no consequences for them to not be more active. So I'd love for you each to just kind of state your own position rather than me putting words in your mouth about what you think of where that conversation is going.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, and it's a really interesting discussion. Well, for me, it's an interesting discussion. I don't know for anyone else, but CDA 230 has sort of two components, and I think, unfortunately, a lot of people didn't necessarily pay attention to the second one. The first part was basically saying that the platforms are not responsible for anyone's speech on that platform. That's the part that's really been litigated the most and has been really important. Basically, and conceptually sort of makes sense, I think, from a common sense standpoint. It says if you, if somebody posts something to your website, you're not legally liable for it if it's defamatory or whatever whatever sort of tort it might violate. Then the second part is that you are not liable for moderation choices, and this actually was the reason why CDA 230 was written in the first place. Was there was this case, the Stratton Oakmont versus Prodigy, where this Wall Street operation, I would say use that loosely. It's the firm that was the movie Wolf of Wall Street was based on. Got very upset that somebody had posted in a Prodigy stock trading forum or something, accused them of being up to no good, which in retrospect appears to have perhaps turned out to be true. And they sued Prodigy, and part of the argument was that because Prodigy moderates its forums somewhat, anything it allows up, therefore it is also liable for. And the court said, yeah, sure. Which, if you take a step back, it could be kind of horrifying, because that means if you moderate at all, you'll then be liable for the moderation choices you did not make. And so the incentives there then are to allow no forums, or to be very, very aggressive in taking down content. Anyone complains, you immediately take it down because you don't want to be liable for any sort of legal dispute. And so, I think we can say that established the norm that allowed for all these platforms to allow people to speak online, which is super important. But somewhere along the way, some people may have forgotten that. And there was this article in Wired recently about like the last 2 years of Facebook and sort of the struggles that Facebook has gone through. And one of the things that I found infuriating was that that article said, within Facebook, they decided not to take these issues, not to get heavy-handed in moderating content on their platform, because they believed if they did so, they would lose their CDA 230 immunity, which is the exact opposite of what the law says. And the article says it a few times, and I sort of snapped at the people who wrote it, saying, this is exactly backwards, and you're sort of peddling this myth. And the feedback that I got from multiple people was not so much that Wired got it wrong, which they did, but that it was an accurate portrayal of what people within Facebook believed. That and it's still not entirely clear who, whether it's the legal team or the policy team or whoever, sort of pushed out a message within Facebook that if we moderate too much, then we will become liable for our moderation and we will lose 230 practices. Now, there is a version of that is slightly more forgivable than that version, which is totally wrong, which is that Facebook is a global company. CDA 230 is only US based. And outside the US, that is somewhat true in some places with caveats, depending on what you're doing. So Facebook could say, since we reach globally, we should hold a standard globally, and that standard is we should be very careful about what we moderate for fear of then being liable, perhaps outside the US, for this. So anyways, sorry, I'm getting very long-winded here, but to bring that back around, all of these attempts to sort of change CDA 230, which is seen as like the way in to regulating these platforms, I think ends up making all of these situations worse. And I don't yet see a way to change CDA 230 that actually improves any of the problems, loosely defined, that people are trying to attack, and almost every one of them, I think, makes them worse. Again, if you're changing the standard of being liable for moderation, then you're going to lead to, one, companies not willing to host other people's speech at all, because the fear of liability could be pretty significant depending on where you are. And we saw after Sesta and Fosta passed, certain sites completely shut down, other sites really greatly limited their content, and they've been, really taking down things that, appear to be perfectly legal, reasonable, free speech, and that should be a concern. The second part of it is that it will lead to just, much greater ability to censor people for almost any speech. And we have a sort of alternative world history to look at, which is the DMCA world, right? So CDA 230 does not cover intellectual property. In the copyright world specifically, there's another law, which is DMCA 512, which has different rules. CDA 230 is a pure immunity. You're not liable. DMCA 512 copyright is a notice and takedown setup. You have to, if you meet certain conditions, you are then put in the safe harbor. One of those conditions is if you receive a valid notice of infringing content, you need to take it down with certain caveats in order to retain the not being liable for that content. And what we've seen, and we have tremendous evidence of this, is that the DMCA process is used widely to censor stuff for reasons that have nothing to do with copyright infringement. But it is a tool to take content down, and therefore people do.
Well, I'm also going to just, as a quick interjection there, because I alluded to how we met.
Yes.
Which was when I was getting doxxed and stalked and harassed, and Twitter did nothing about my problems. And Twitter's own engineer told me, if you'd like to get pictures of your child taken down off the internet, which is what was happening to me, file the copyright claim. We'll have them down in 10 minutes. Meanwhile, I had waited 48 hours already for those to move through the nice normal harassment channels. So I think that one of the things here that, particularly in 2015 or 16 when this was happening to me, was that there was no sense that the platforms were going to do anything at all to help deal with things that were, that should have been taken down under violations. And so it is a matter of using whatever loophole you have at your disposal at that point to make the problem go away.
Yeah, and I understand, and I can't remember if it was you who said this or somebody else, and I think it's a valid point, which is that if people are using your DMCA process to remove content for non-copyright purposes, you probably have a bigger problem in terms of your overall processes for handling, abuse, harassment, or whatever else it is. You have to, as a platform, should shoulder some of that blame. But that doesn't mean that we should, set up another legal hole in which, people can, slip through. Because for every case where you may have valid reasons for obviously wanting pictures of your children and doxing information offline, there are so many other cases of content, being pulled down because of completely ridiculous. We receive all the time DMCA notices for articles about, we had an article about somebody who was fined by the FTC for revenge porn. He had put up a revenge porn site and got hit by the FTC. That individual then filed a copyright notice claiming that his name was covered by copyright, and therefore we had to pull down our story. Google was supposed to remove it from their search. He wanted the FTC's own press release pulled. I mean, that's sort of an extreme example, but there are a lot of other ones as well. There was a story recently where, somebody had mocked a video game review on Twitter, and the journalist who had written the original review used the DMCA to get that pulled off of Twitter. I mean, there's all sorts of examples of, if you provide this tool that has legal weight behind it to get content pulled down, it is used that way. And,
But it has transparency reports. And I want Guillaume to dive back into this one too. Just get in there.
Yeah.
Because you had some ideas for a middle ground to.
Yeah, I think we have to think that the CDA was voted like 20 years ago when platforms were very different from when they are right now. They were not recommending content. Now platforms are not just hosting, they are also recommending. So the right to be hosted is not the same than the right to be recommended.
Sure.
So let's take a concrete example of something that has been recommended. That, for instance, Barack Obama was born in Kenya. Something that, it's great that it's hosted on the platform, that people can say whatever they want. But when it's been recommended by YouTube's algorithm, on which I worked more than 300 million times, you're more than the number of Americans in the country, you realize, there might be something out of control going on here. So at some point, we need to know that it's been recommended by the algorithm, so that we know in which kind of reality we live in. Why are people really believing that? And it's because it's been recommended, not because they start to be crazy suddenly.
So that you think the transparency around the, you and I agree on this. I think the right to, the freedom of speech is not the same as freedom of reach, right? You don't have the right to algorithmic amplification. You have the right to be discoverable for whatever crackpot theory you want to put out on the internet, but you are not owed the amplification. And that's where we get at the kind of curatorial function. And you've been talking about how CDA 230 should be potentially tailored to deal with that problem? Is that your current work?
Exactly. So, so what we had in the old world of news media, we know what gets recommended, we know what gets put on TV, we know what gets viewed by people. So right now, we ought to know what gets viewed on YouTube, and whether it's by just YouTube users demanding YouTube to show what they recommend to people, and not what they recommend a few times, but what they recommend hundreds of millions of times. Or whether it's with legislation. At some point, we need to know what's happening.
And I'm all for greater transparency, with the caveat that transparency potentially, when you're talking about something around algorithms and recommendations, the reason why a lot of platforms have been fairly secretive is because a certain level of transparency also opens up the ability to game those systems, right? Which could potentially make the problem worse. So, it puts myself in a very uncomfortable position to ever argue against transparency. I'm a very strong advocate of more transparency, but I recognize where there is concern about what kind of transparency and how it is revealed for the sake of avoiding this issue, which could actually make the problem worse.
But platforms are gamed. I mean, your work shows that. Just Facebook, the number of fake accounts that were taken down shows that it has been gamed. And so we have like foreign agents who are extremely good at gaming the platforms, so they don't need this transparency. They reverse engineer the algorithm. They understand the algorithm, and they have an advantage because we don't have transparency. So transparency would help small creators, small YouTube creators, to get better than Russia today. So I think that will be.
That's a fair point. I mean, if it allows better people to game the system, then that's great. But I believe you, and I am willing to try it as an experiment. I just want to make sure that when you're talking about state actors or very powerful groups, especially ones that have experience sort of gaming that algorithm, potentially giving them that information, they're ahead of the game. And so I worry about it. I would like to believe that you're right, and again, I support transparency conceptually, and I would like to see that happen. I understand why there hasn't been as much transparency yet, and so that's where I come down on.
My feeling on that is we see a lot of changes being made in fighting the last war, litigating 2016, that are not actually going to do anything to stop a determined state actor. No, the ID checks for ads is one example. I think net takes out a lot of spammers. I think it catches a lot of the low rent 2-bit, kind of shitty fake account makers and bad ad pages. But I don't think it gets Russian intelligence. They can print their own IDs. This is not a real stopgap against, which is where I think that there is a thinking about the greatest impact and where that, what kind of changes can be made to deal with the mid-tier, so, kind of, we don't really know what the distribution looks like right now, and that's also a function of not having much transparency. Sure. So I do agree with the transparency piece. And it sounds like you are more in favor of actually kind of regulatory, like lawmakers stepping in to intercede here, and you are more in favor of shifting norms. I'm curious how you shift norms, and also from you, how you think regulation happens in a locked Congress. So maybe we start with the norms guy.
the norms guy. I want to be clear. I don't think it's easy, certainly, to shift norms. I think it does happen, but it's usually not in a directed fashion. And so some of this is sort of screaming at the wind and hoping that it'll go in the direction that I scream. But, what I fear more is the sort of unintended, or in some cases intended, consequences of trying to regulate this, especially by people who I don't think really understand how the technology works, or sort of what will happen if they do this. And almost every statement by almost every policy person thinking about regulating these things tends to get important details wrong. And so I'm very, very worried about that. The other thing that I'll say in terms of the norm side of it is that, the internet space, if you go back over the past 25, 30 years has shown some pretty massive disruption at times, and, for a while I point to this article from 2007, so 11 years ago, and I forget the exact title, but it was something to the effect of, MySpace is a natural monopoly that will never be toppled. That turned out to not be very accurate. And
did you write it?
I did not write it. I did not write it, but it was an interesting article, and it mentions Facebook briefly. It's like, this little piddly thing that will never have a chance against MySpace. We live in a world where, disruption happens, new technologies come along, and sometimes it happens because the platforms become a disaster, which you could argue was the case with MySpace. I mean, MySpace just became this really awful experience. Facebook, came in and completely wiped the slate with them, in part by providing a better experience. Now, what is the better experience and why and how is an open question. But could we live in a world where, a new player comes along and says, hey, I could build a better experience that doesn't have harassment and hate and all this kind of stuff, or I could open up and, set up a protocol system that allows for competition in terms of the algorithm and everything like that. And, maybe that begins to catch on, or maybe it uses a different business model that isn't like suck up all your data and sell it to the highest bidder, or however you want to put it. There are opportunities for startups and new businesses to come in. There are some people who argue the existing providers are so big, have so much gravity that is an absolute impossibility. That's an open question. I don't think that's true. We've seen very big companies collapse before. I think we'll see it again. I think that Facebook, Google, Twitter, I think they have some problems. I think that as such large organizations, they're not very good at reacting to stuff. They have certain elements I think, Facebook has been pretty aggressive and sort of, spending ridiculous amounts of money on any tiny company that looks like it might possibly have a chance of disrupting it. And that's, worth watching and seeing if it's sort of blocking that potential disruption. But I think that, allowing for competition, allowing for new services to pop up, there's a chance that we could, change the way these things work just through competition.
Yeah, so to be clear, I think like regulation is the worst possible option, because what you said, like politicians don't understand what they're talking about. They don't understand all the consequences. So it's kind of last resort we want. So what would be great is to have discussion with platforms, and try to have platforms like give the minimum amount of transparency that guarantees us that we're in touch with reality, we know what's going on, and make it not the system not gameable. But and I understand the platform don't have any incentive to do that. At some point, we need to have regulation, because that's what happened with libel. We have regulation against libel, because otherwise we would live in a constant fake news environment.
Well, I'm not going to go down to the question around defamation and libel, but what I would say is that I think these companies are now facing greater and greater challenge. I mean, they're being slammed by the public. They're being slammed by politicians on sort of both sides of the traditional spectrum. They're getting attacked in all sorts of ways. They have incentives themselves to begin to think more carefully about how they handle this stuff. And I think, for all the talk and claims that people make that these platforms don't care at all, that's not true. And far be it from me to be sort of a defender of any of these platforms, because I don't think they're very good at these things. But I think they're recognizing more and more how important these issues are, and they are taking them seriously. They are also recognizing how difficult these decisions are. There have now been 2 different content moderation summit conferences, one out here in California, one in DC, there's another one in a couple weeks in New York, where these platforms are actually revealing for the first time exactly what they're doing around content moderation, whereas before it was entirely a black box. I don't think they're necessarily revealing enough, and they're not being as transparent as they hopefully, could or should be. But they are doing it. But, the more you look at it, the more you realize how difficult and challenging these things are. And like there's a new documentary, I think it's going to be shown on PBS soon, called The Cleaners, which you and I both saw a screening of recently, which I think did a really good job of sort of highlighting how difficult content moderation is, that there aren't easy answers. There was also a Radio Lab episode recently that was, I think, very effective in doing the same thing, and also Motherboard, which is a publication from Vice, did a really, really great, very thorough article in which some of the reporters actually got to spend time at Facebook in the meetings where they're discussing sort of the content moderation stuff. I think there's a greater and greater understanding that these are really difficult decisions to make, but and so it would be great to I guess I think that there's enough public pressure that I'm hoping that either they will change or competition will spring up without necessarily needing to go down the route of regulation, which I think in many cases the regulatory proposals will make the problem worse, in that the only companies who can really abide by the type of regulation that's being suggested are those giant platforms. So if the idea is to limit the power of these platforms, you're actually getting the reverse, because you're sort of locking those in.
Yeah, there's a lot of chances that will happen if the regulation is badly designed.
We wanted to open it up for questions.
Great. Yeah, so if you're in San Francisco, you can ask it in the room. We have a few that came over Slack, so we'll start with that. Give folks in the room maybe time to think of a question. So in Slack, this question, the first question is for you, Mike. You mentioned that 230 would protect platforms, at least in the United States, when they moderate abusive content and fake news, but often they don't. So are fake news and attacks on marginalized groups actually good business for the platforms? Is there an interest in why they aren't doing it?
I mean, you'd have to ask the platform specifically. I don't think so. I don't think that any of the platforms are saying, like, we should allow harassment and fake news and attacks on people because it's good for business. I think that, if you talk to the people who work at all of these platforms in sort of like the trust and safety realm, all of them take that job very, very seriously, and all of them are very, very concerned about those kinds of things appearing on their platforms and how do you deal with them. I don't think they're treating it frivolously at all. And, I think, it could go a long way towards, getting people to understand that if there were more transparency, or, at events like these content moderation summits where those people speak out and you see what they're dealing with and you see the sort of challenges and how difficult some of these choices are, but it is a common accusation. I just don't think it's really accurate.
Great. One more. Someone in the room asked this up. In the room.
Very intrigued by the user-controlled filter idea, and you talked about it a little bit as, you control all the content you see, or as it currently is. Is there a hybrid model where you could control the concentration of what you've already seen before? So, I want to see 70% of things I've already seen before and 30% fresh content, and someone could dial that up and dial it down?
Yeah, I think, again, if you get to the point where you're dealing with sort of open protocols where anyone can design the system for the view and create different tools for it. I like to think of it similar to like email, right? Email itself is a protocol, and different, you can communicate across different platforms. And then, different people put their own spin on email. A lot of people now use Gmail because they put a view onto email that was considered better than lots of other platforms, and they also had a good spam filter. But not everybody does, and you can shift and you can communicate across those different platforms. If you were to move to this world where you could open up things as a protocol, and anyone could build a filter. One of the kinds of filters you could build is exactly that, which is, I want to see certain things, but I want, I don't want to be stuck in my filter bubble. It's the anti-filter bubble filter, like, please pop in a few serendipitous bits of information, and that might be really compelling, and therefore I think that's an opportunity for somebody to create a filter like that says, like, I'm going to pop in something neat and useful that wouldn't necessarily fall into the filter bubble. Yeah, sure, you could totally do it.
Would that be a possibility for regulation?
I don't see how you would. The question was
Regulation is.
Yeah, could you regulate that? I don't see how you could regulate that reasonably, and it would create all sorts of other questions if you were to do that, because you would have a situation where, perhaps on the flip side, where are you regulating that everyone who doesn't want to see fake news has to see 30% fake news, right? You open up all sorts of very questionable issues with that. So I don't see how you would regulate that without very weird consequences coming out of it.
Yeah, totally agree that the future is really having more control, and that's how we get there. That's important. And for me, people need to realize how bad the current system is before they want to install something new. So that's why I'm focusing on that right now.
Okay. Another question, Renee, you actually pointed out that a lot of solutions for what we know is happening in 2016 a lot of the solutions were about 2016, but what is coming next? So can the panel weigh on what is happening right now and the midterm elections? And if regulation isn't the best approach, what things can we do to address the upcoming elections?
So I think there's a difference between the idea of fake news and information versus what we see. Most of the stuff that was put up by Russia in 2016 would not have come down under any kind of content moderation framework short of authenticity of account. And that's because it was not highly sensational. It was polarizing. It was partisan. It was offensive at times, but there's no rules against offensiveness in moderation like of that to that mild extent. So I think that what we look at is authenticity of narrative and then distribution patterns, and that's really what at New Knowledge, where we build tools to look at the stuff, that's what we've chosen to focus on. The idea that it's not the content. This isn't a truth and narrative problem. This is much more of an authenticity of accounts and voices. And the argument that we make is that it doesn't matter what message you're putting out there if you're using sort of inauthentic means to do so, if you're manufacturing speech. So rather than one person, one voice, it's one person with a botnet and then 5 people on the opposite side, then you're no longer really having an authentic dialogue. And so should the platforms be doing more to capture interference at those levels, much more kind of algorithmic signatures of malintent in distribution?
But you could have third parties who play this role and can plug in.
Yeah, and I think more directly to the question in terms of what's happening in 2018, the answer is not enough, but more than happened in 2016, which is not a satisfying answer. And I would like for there to be more evidence of stuff happening. But part of this is the nature of the problem, which is that it's a difficult, ever-changing problem. And if you're just going after the last problem, which is you can define what the old problem was to some extent and sort of try and target that, but that misses whatever the new one is, which just sort of highlights the difficulty of the position that the platforms are in with the current setup, where they're sort of the only source making the decisions on how to deal with the content.
And what we see for people trying to get around the authenticity piece is that we actually see them engaging with real people and then laundering the narrative through real people, which makes it harder to find because it is going through our real American voice. In some ways, it's actually a return to sort of the old intelligence methods, just like enhanced by the internet, as opposed to creation of a new collection of strategies designed for the internet, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and one of the things that has to be noted, I think everyone rushes immediately to sort of blame the technology for this. There is an element of confirmation bias that drives much of this and sort of human nature. And if people were better at critical thinking and not rushing to confirmation bias, that'd be great. But it's also impossible. And I think everyone, even those of us who think about these things and deal with these things, have to admit that we're guilty of confirmation bias and, ourselves, and making mistakes and jumping to conclusions about things as well. And so, I feel like to some extent, it's a little unfair to just blame these large technology platforms for surfacing the fact that humans are imperfect, because humans are imperfect.
Yeah, but they are not helping either. They are not like trying to help us. They know our bias.
They could do a better job, but at no point am I suggesting that they're doing the best job they possibly can. I think that there could be a ridiculous amount of improvement, and they should do a lot more. But again, I think that you get that by opening them up for more competition rather than expecting them to magically figure out these difficult problems.
Such a complicated topic. I think we've got like 2 minutes left. We didn't even really get at responsibility, right? Which is, such a core piece of this. And, and we touched on it briefly with the curation piece, I think, and the things that I've written before, and I think things that you've both written before about, in my opinion, you do bear more responsibility when you are actively promoting the content. That's when you have switched to taking a much more, you have some culpability for the downstream impact of what you've chosen to recommend, as opposed to the search box returns, Alex Jones.
Sure. I mean, I can't disagree with that. I mean, obviously, if you're doing the recommendation, you are choosing something to say, like, I recommend this, and therefore you're putting your weight as the platform behind it. And that comes with some responsibility. Whether or not that's legal responsibility is a separate question. But that's the nature of why, these platforms have to figure out how they want to deal with that. And recognizing that they're all facing these really difficult challenges about how, every solution leads to other problems. And so weighing those different things right now, they haven't necessarily done a good job. I'm not sure telling them you're responsible for this content changes that. So.
Well, I think since we have to wrap up, you've both done such an exceptional job with your writing, calling attention to the various facets of the problem and the nuance of the conversation. And I really appreciate all the work that you both do and are continuing to do. So then, thank you for participating.
Thanks, Renee.
Yeah, and thank you.
All right, if we could just advance to slide 1, we're going to do a very brief announcement. So you've raised a lot of issues around that many consumers have around just dialogue and getting proper information, and Mozilla is actually rolling some products out later this week to help people who may be getting information on the platforms or elsewhere, just to find more information and express what they're thinking about the election in a more safe way. So on October 4th, which is this week, on Mozilla.org, we are launching a special edition of Firefox. It's a bundle with something called Facebook Container, which lets you go and speak your mind about the election elsewhere, but Facebook won't necessarily know about it. And that'll also be bundled with a tool from ProPublica that is a crowdsourced tool that lets everyone who's viewing ads share what ads they're seeing, so that there's a public reference of which ads are being shown. We have other things that will also be on Mozilla.org later this week, October 4th. A tool to, sorry? Mozilla Corporation. So this is all from Mozilla Corporation. There will be a tool to let you look up your voter registration and register, and there will be curated content from Pocket to make sure that you get quality content, a bunch of stuff. So do look out on October 4th on Mozilla.org from Mozilla Corporation. Thank you.